Welcome to the recorded lecture for Unit 27 Bio 240 class. We're going to be talking today about male reproductive anatomy and female reproductive anatomy. So in this chapter, in the lab manual, we are only dealing with the anatomical components, so the structures, the organs, where they're located, what they look like. Make sure to follow this in the lab manual, see all the illustrations and diagrams. We're going to go over the male reproductive system first because it's a little bit simpler and has sort of fewer components, and then we're going to obviously talk about the female as well. One important thing to keep in mind for the reproductive system is that these organs in the male and the female are one of the few systems that are quite a bit different, obviously, in each gender, in each sex. However, we can always talk about homology or analogy of the organs, how they could be compared. So for instance, for every single structure in the female, in the male, there's a very similar structure or almost equivalent. And most important, this would be thinking about the testes, which are the male gonads producing the sex cells in the male. The equivalent of that are the ovaries in the female, producing the sex cells of the female, which are the female ova cells or the female egg cells. This is very important to keep in mind, this homology. You can do this for every single structure that exists pretty much. I will mention those that are particularly relevant to us, and you can find more in the book. Just something to keep in mind to help you understand this better. Keep in mind that during the embryological development, the male and the female look essentially identical from the reproductive perspective, and only later in life starts to differentiate as organs develop and due to influences of either testosterone, the male hormone, or estrogens in the female, then they kind of start to differentiate further and become more unique in each gender. Now, for the male reproductive system, again, the most important organ we're talking about here in the pelvis are the testes, also called testicles. Now, they produce sperm, that's why we call them male gonads, and the sperm are called gametes, which is just a general term for sex cells. So the male gonads, right, there's two of them, right and left. They have a very unique structure that we're gonna kind of talk about briefly here. Normally, you do want to see this obviously in histology as well, so you can find them in the book and through additional resources that will be available online. Now, for the testes, testes are considered externalized organs, so they are protected by the scrotum, which is essentially the sac, the skin that covers the testes. But the testes, unlike the ovaries in the female, which are deep inside in the pelvis, the testes are more sort of closely externalized, and this has to do with the temperature control that is so important for them. Sperm cannot develop normally unless the temperature conditions are just right. They cannot be too hot or too cold for the sperm, otherwise they will not form. Because of this, inside the scrotum, there is what's called a cremasteric muscle. This is a muscle that's involuntary, that's attached to the testes itself and is able to regulate the temperature of sperm formation, basically by allowing either the testes to be brought closer to the body or pushed further away. Again, this is called cremasteric muscle. This is an involuntary muscle inside the scrotum attached to the testes, controlling the temperature for the proper formation of the sperm. Proper formation of sperm is called spermatogenesis, which will be discussed in the next lecture. And now this is a process that's taking place in what's called seminiferous tubules, which are kind of similar, like you think about the way we saw tubules in the nephron and the kidney. These are except for filtering the blood and producing urine. Obviously, these are doing a process of essentially allowing the sperm to mature and kind of facing internally into the lumen of these tubules, and eventually more and more sperm are produced and continue their process of maturation later on. Now, when you see the testes by itself, the testis is protected by multiple connective tissue and other layers. Tunica vaginalis and tunica albuginea are two most important layers there. Tunica just essentially means tunic or like a layer, and you'll see them again in diagrams, things like that. Once you dissect through deeper, you see the actual microscopic seminiferous tubules, And as the sperm is maturing there and getting closer to the end process of maturation, actually migrates into the epididymis, which is the smaller upper portion component of the testes, where there finally the sperm gets its flagella, gets its tail, and finalizes its maturation, and then is ready to be delivered out of the body or out of the testes. So when the sperm needs to travel out of the testes, it will go through this hollow tube called vas deferens or ductus deferens, and that will ultimately connect us to the rest of the path, which is merging into the urethra in the prostate, and ultimately, right, the urethra needs to communicate through the penis to the outside of the body for taking the sperm out of the body and delivering them to the female. Now, so when the vas deferens is traveling through the body, the important component is that it needs to be protected, needs a blood supply, needs a vascular supply, and nerve supply. So that's provided by the spermatic cord, which is always this large structure that you see kind of surrounding the vas deferens. And something very important to keep in mind, so again, but the vas deferens is the actual tube that carries the sperm from the testes to the rest of the reproductive organs. Now, in order for the sperm to successfully be able to actually get out of the body, it needs to be protected by semen, or that liquid chemical mixture that nourishes and protects the sperm, especially realizing that sperm are just individual cells, and so they're very sensitive, they're very delicate outside of the body, and they will really not survive, especially not in the female reproductive tract. And so we have these collection of exocrine glands that secrete through their ducts semen, basically a collection of different chemicals that protect the sperm. So the exocrine glands are prostate, the biggest of them, seminal vesicles, and bulbourethral glands. They all look somewhat different, but they're making the same thing, right? These different chemicals, essentially the content of the semen that will merge with the sperm as the sperm is traveling towards the urethra and then through the urethra. So the prostate is located right as the urethra is coming out from the bladder, right? It's kind of this walnut-like or rounded structure immediately hugging the urethra as it exits the bladder. And the seminal vesicles are just these small structures located kind of behind the prostate, and bulbourethral glands are even smaller, and they are lower than the prostate, kind of deeper in the muscle as the urethra is going through the penis. Now, like I said, all of these structures, as you see them essentially under a microscope and the histology slides, they all should look relatively similar. They all are glands producing semen to help the sperm survive outside of the body. So they provide nutritional support, physical support, and allow the sperm to make its successful journey into the female reproductive tract. Now, obviously, the sperm needs to be delivered to the female, right, through the penis. So the penis serves two purposes. One is for the delivery of semen and sperm. The other is for the delivery, basically for a urinary tract, right, as the urethra goes through the penis. Now, most important structure of the penis, so I'm going to draw this right here. Basically, if you do a cross-sectional cut of the penis, you see there's going to be these sort of three kind of cylindrical, circular components inside. These are called corpora cavernosa, these two top ones, and the bottom one is corpora spongiosum. All of these is sponge-like tissues containing lots of blood vessels, what's called venous sinusoids, which are specialized types of blood vessels that, in this case, fill up the tissue with blood during erection so that the penis can basically deliver the sperm successfully to the female during the sexual intercourse. So most important about these is the two top ones are the corpora cavernosum, this is the pair of tissue, and the one that's spongiosum, the bottom one, actually has the urethra running through it, the penile urethra, which obviously carries either urine or sperm through that passageway. And so obviously the urethra is ultimately connected to the bladder, right, as we saw in the urinary tract already in the urinary chapter, and ultimately has this external urethral opening or meatus, the outside at the tip of the penis, to allow the urine or the sperm to come out. Now, make sure again to look at these illustrations to see exactly what this looks like anatomically in the book, in the lab manual, and online. One important condition associated with this in terms of pathology is that it's possible that sometimes an erection can take place that is prolonged excessively, so something over 2 or 3 hours. This is what's called priapism. And this is a condition where basically, for whatever reason, either due to overuse of medications like Viagra for erectile dysfunctions, or due to side effects of other medications, or other causes, the erection is prolonged. This causes damage, obviously, to the penis, to the nerves, and need to be treated surgically or sometimes medically, right? It becomes basically a medical emergency, so the person has to go to the hospital for this. Again, the condition is called priapism, and it's referring to an abnormal state where the erection is prolonged excessively, way beyond the normal expectations for this. Okay, for the female reproductive system, we have the most important organs are the ovaries. They are the female gonads, right? The equivalent of the testes in the male. So they are actually retroperitoneal organs, which means they sit all the way in the pelvis, but towards the back, sort of kind of like kidneys were retroperitoneal, as we discussed this before. The ovaries are held by suspensory and broad ligaments, which are attached to the uterus, the rest of the reproductive system, so they're not floating in midair, obviously. Inside the ovaries, the anatomy is quite a bit different from the testes. The ovaries are filled with follicles, ovarian follicles, at different stages of development depending on the age of the female and whether she's in the reproductive years or not, younger or older. There's all kinds of different kind of time-dependent issues here. Unlike in the male, where basically the testes are essentially pretty much the same in functioning, starting from puberty and onwards for the rest of the male's life, where the sperm is produced continuously. The ovaries are not like that. They start the production of the oocytes or the ova, basically the egg cells, early on, even before the female is born. And the process continues throughout their productive years, right after the puberty especially has been reached. So the outline of this will be shown in the book, and you'll see this in our lab manual and the textbook. But basically, you want to keep in mind that essentially we have a set of different follicles that look different under a microscope. And the first one is the primordial follicles, again, primitive follicles just at the early stages of development. And then we continue through other stages to graphene follicles. These are the mature follicles that are actually able to release the oocytes during ovulation. Right? Remember, ovulation is part of the ovarian and menstrual cycles, which are monthly cycles that a female has in order to allow these follicles to mature and release one egg at least at a time in the hopes of fertilization and pregnancy formation. So if the egg has been fertilized, if it met the sperm in the fallopian tubes or somewhere in the reproductive tract, then that follicle, the released egg, will become corpus luteum and will start to secrete progesterone and basically become hormonally active to sustain pregnancy. And if fertilization has not occurred and basically the interstitial lining is shed during the menstrual period, then that follicle becomes corpus albicans, which is just like a white body, and basically it does not do anything, it just sort of atrophies and kind of disappears. Now, when we think of the reproductive tract now, so I'm going to draw this, these are our ovaries, we have fallopian tubes, we have the uterus, the vagina. So the fallopian tubes are hollow tubes that connect to to the ovaries, and essentially they have these finger-like projections called the fimbriae. These are important to sort of catch the egg, as the fallopian tubes are actually not in direct physical contact with the ovaries. And when they catch the egg, they basically allow the egg to be kind of pulled in after ovulation into the fallopian tubes so they can begin their travel into the body of the uterus. Now, the uterus itself consists of the top portion, the rounded portion, which is the fundus. The rest is most of this, the body, and the lower portion is the cervix. The uterus is essentially a ball of smooth muscle that's quite small in size, and only upon pregnancy becomes much bigger in size, right, depending on how the child is growing, the fetus is developing. As we'll see more of this in the next chapter. But essentially, you're thinking of myometrium as the main component, muscular component, the smooth muscle of the organ, and then endometrium and the endometrial cavity essentially is the internal component that's actually hormonally active and responds to changes in hormones during the menstrual phases and in that 28-day cycle of the menstruation that the females undergo every month. So endometrial cavity is the one that changes, it's growing, getting filled up with blood vessels, and getting ready to accept the implantation of the blastocyst, or the developing basically embryo. And if fertilization has not taken place, then the endometrial lining can be shed, and that results in the bleeding that takes place in the menstrual period. So the myometrium does not change at any point other than when basically the baby is growing inside and the uterus needs to enlarge, but the endometrium is always changing because that is hormonally active and very sensitive to the hormone levels. When you're thinking of the uterus, very important component is to keep in mind that the cervix is the direct connection and has an opening to the vaginal area below it over here. So that opening from the point of view from the vagina, as you can be seen during a pelvic exam, is what's called cervical external os. OS is the name from this opening. And basically the cervix will allow all kinds of changes to occur, right? It allows the sperm to enter into the endometrial cavity, and also when the baby is being born, right, during labor and delivery, for the child to go through, before it enters the vaginal cavity, to go through the cervix out of the uterus. Right, so the cervix is extremely important, as we can see the cervix very well during a pelvic exam and during pap smears, to be able to take biopsy samples and scrapings of the cervix, and kind of is sort of a window to the reproductive cavity, reproductive system, to see what's inside the endometrium, what is happening. Right, this is a kind of very useful, very important area to recognize here. Again, connection, right, serves between the vaginal canal, then the cervix, then the endometrial cavity of the uterus. So the vagina itself, the vaginal canal, is basically a muscular tube, 9 centimeters long, that allows for the male to deliver the sperm to the female reproductive tract. The internal environment of the vaginal cavity is essentially kind of hostile to the sperm. That's why it's mostly acidic, right? So that allows, it kind of makes it difficult for the sperm to survive. And if it wasn't for these secretions from the prostate and these other exocrine glands with the semen, the sperm would not be able to make it through the vaginal area. And that's why, again, we have these secretions to help the sperm survive and travel further to make its way to fertilize the egg inside the uterus. Now, for the external anatomy, the general name for external anatomy in the female is called the vulva, and we have these skin folds that take place, are there, the labia majora, labia minora, and so the labia minora basically is essentially could be thought of as analogous to the scrotum in the male, that protects the testes. And when you're thinking about, speaking of homology, so if you think about the penis, what is the equivalent of the penis, of that venous sinusoid erectile tissue in the male? But that's going to be the clitoris in the female. Obviously, the clitoris is always thought of a very different structure. It's actually much larger internally, something that is hard to kind of visualize, but on dissection, you can see that it's much bigger, and that externalized portion continues inside. Histologically, it's the same venous sinusoids that are basically fill up with blood and expand and enlarge, just like it was in the male. The only difference is that obviously in the male, the penis also carries the urethra, while the clitoris does not connect to the urethra, and the urethra is located kind of separately from the clitoris. And the vaginal urethral openings, like I said, obviously in that area as well, as part of the external anatomy. Make sure to always, as you're studying, as you're preparing for these chapters, make sure you're looking at the book, comparing the male and female structures through the illustrations. You can view models online, photographs of them, to see it sort of in 3 dimensions. Very important to compare them. Again, keep in mind of the homology for these structures as well.